Welcome boys and girls, Christine here with a discussion about Tzarina Katarin of Kislev in Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires. Katarin used to be one of the worst legendary lords in the game to play. Between her lackluster faction effects, her lackluster lord effects, her lackluster skill line, her starting position, and the many issues of Kislev, it wasn't really a great situation. But is she worth playing right now? And is she still the worst legendary lord for Kislev? Those are some perfectly legitimate discussions on the subject. So, let's take into consideration faction effects, starting position, lord effects, skill line, because of course Kislev itself as a race has been vastly improved. So certainly Katarin is no longer in the F tier minus or Daniel tier of legendary lords in the game. That is the situation she has is a much better one, especially since she can confederate Zavastra or the Tzarina Enclave very quickly in her campaign in a couple of turns. That is a really solid benefit. Another thing she can do, and this may seem a bit weird, but if you're looking at playing a Kislev campaign and maximizing the supporter output, Katarin does have a downside in the sense that she cannot get orthodoxy support unless she's fighting against their enemies. But on the flip side, you can manipulate the situation here in a Kislev campaign in such a way that you would be able to get infinite supporters. What you do is you'd fight this faction, the Norskans, you'd push them into Igorov, and then you just continuously sack Igorov again and again and again. It would work for a while. And bonus points if you get Kastaltin to join in the war. And if Kastaltin sends an army or someone sends an army over here, you can just put it under siege, and since their turn is going to be one of the last turns, what would happen is the AI would pretty much sally out when their supplies run out completely. They would sally out when they're about to surrender, but they would do so after every other legendary lord has taken their turn. I don't think that's a great dynamic in a campaign, but it does work. It is worth pointing out. I don't appreciate it necessarily. I personally wouldn't want to use it. One of the things to be said about Warhammer 2 is that you had campaigns in Warhammer 2, or a lot of campaigns, where one of the best strategies was to just find the settlement for a certain AI faction and just continuously sack it again and again and again and again for experience, for money, for various resources. You might be incentivized to do this as Kislev in general, but Katarin is in the best position to handle that. Unlike, say, for instance, Boris Ursus, like, you don't have the luxury of doing this as Boris Ursus. You don't have the luxury of doing it as Kastaltin or Astankia. So there is a benefit there, despite some of the downsides with supporters that Katarin does have. Now, in terms of starting position, as stated, you can get the Tzarina Enclave and then also get Prague as a confederation option fairly quickly. The one issue is that it would be much better if she actually started with Igorov under her control, and literally I would take Fort Jakova as the first battle, because then you would end up with Zavastra. Sure, you'd probably lose the Tzarina Enclave, but having to march east and then north is not necessarily the best campaign dynamic to deal with, especially with people like Vlad and Azazel. So something worth pointing out over there. Furthermore, Katarin does have the weakest starting army of all the Kislevite legendary lords, because she gets some armor Kossars, wing lancers, and ice guards with swords. Boris Ursus might as well have an endgame starting army. Astankia, not necessarily the best, but she does have Akshina, she does have Incarnate Elemental of Beasts. Kastaltin, he has Streltsy, and can easily start recruiting armor Kossars in his campaign if he so wants to. So there's pros for every other Kislevite legendary lord compared to Katarin in terms of their starting army and the dynamics of their starting position. At least in the sense that they're closer to the enemies, and being close to an enemy means you can take them out. Especially if you're playing on a higher difficulty, you don't want the AI to start really being able to utilize all those significant campaign cheats. Just worth pointing out aspect. Now, in terms of faction effects, well, you start with ice sculpting already researched, and this is actually a pretty big benefit, and I do consider it a faction benefit because she's the only one that starts with it, in the sense that you can get 2 Frost Maidens very quickly in this campaign. Or you can just train them, not even utilize the load save character system, just train them normally for the Ice Court system, because you do have a 10% Ice Court training cost reduction and a +3 hero recruit rank for them. You also get the Owens of Magic Power Reserve capacity of +20 and 15 research rate, as well as having a tier benefit for the Ice Court that is permitted in terms of a tier advantage. Those are all really solid benefits to work with. And while having -20 diplomatic relations with Castalton can be an issue in terms of confederating him, at the very least you no longer have that kind of limitation in terms of confederation that plagued Katarin's campaign for a very, very long time. To be sure, you're not as good as Boris Ursus or Ostankia because you don't have Wasteland or Magical Forest as Ostankia does, and Chaotic Wasteland is uninhabitable. Though, funnily enough, all of Kislev's campaigns did benefit from the terrain change that CA introduced to Throne's Decay that was primarily designed to really help Malachite's campaign in his conquest of Norska. But faction effects, pretty solid, actually. Like, get the job done. Like, they're not like Boris Ursus. Compared to Castalton, however, how do I feel about them? Well, the ward save for Patriarchs is very substantial for Castalton. Absolutely. As are some of the Kossar benefits, leadership melee attack benefits. But realistically, Katarin's benefits here are going to, typically speaking, be more useful in a campaign, especially in a longer campaign, I would say. Especially now that we no longer have the severe limitations in terms of increasing Frost Maiden capacity, because now you can just get the ministerial housing and get the hero capacity for Frost Maidens, or you can get that capacity through Atamans, or both. So those are improved situations. Recruitment-wise, you do have, as I said, a weakest army and a limited recruitment capabilities. You will be relying quite a bit on Slavite warriors and regular Kossars until you get to tier 2 settlements, which, if you confederate, like, this is one of the reasons you want to confederate the Druzina Enclave very quickly. They do start with tier 2 settlements, so they can actually give you that armored Kossar recruitment, which is going to make up for Katarin's deficiencies from a military standpoint. Okay. Her Lord effects and special skill line, though, this is the weakest part of her entire campaign. She does get 2 supporters, she does reduce corruption, but because of the way corruption works, it's just not really a significant benefit. And while Castalton doesn't have a corruption benefit, Ostankia does, Boris Ursus does. So, and due to the way corruption works, at the moment where it gets reduced significantly when you conquer territory, it's not really a big deal. Anyway, like, this would have been a big deal back in Warhammer 1 or 2, but not so much in Warhammer 3. I get the feeling like the people who designed Warhammer 3, like, there were a bunch of changes in terms of, like, things like corruption changes and all that kind of stuff. Like, there were differences in how they designed. Like, there were clearly some things designed on the basis, okay, this would be great for Warhammer 1 and 2, but then the people designing the campaign map and the systems of the campaign obviously had other ideas. She did used to have a significant Ice Guard upkeep benefit. She still retains 25%, but that has been reduced. However, Kislev's economy is substantially better. She does get a miscast base chance of -50%. That sounds great, and it would be freaking amazing for a better caster than Katarin. I think the problem with Katarin as a legendary lord is that she's trying to kind of do everything in terms of her special skill line. Like, she has the best mount options, she has the Warbear, she has the Frostworm, she has the Ice Court Sled, unique to her. So those are the best mount options in a Kislev campaign. Well, Astankia's siege capability with her, inherent mount is very substantial, but in terms of open field battles or battles in general, having Frostworms and Ice Court Sled, very solid. But the special skill line that Katarin has and her magical choice are just weak. So Ice Magic is not as good as Tempest Magic. Like, there's some useful things, but keep in mind, Winds of Magic in a battle, regardless of the kind of benefits you're getting, unless you have some way of getting infinite Winds of Magic in a battle, and there are some ways, like you look at Elspeth's special Hellstorm rocket batteries, things like that, right? Or Scragg's ability of generating infinite Winds of Magic in a battle, that can work. But when you have limited Winds of Magic, the school of magic you go for is important. And simply put, Ice Magic is not as good as Tempest Magic. Hawks of Miska is an incredibly powerful spell. Like, Heart of Winter is not as good as Hawks of Miska. Not even freaking close in that respect. Now, a good caster would also have a special skill line that would really benefit their kind of special spell casting capability. Katarin does not have that. She does have 10% Winds of Magic cost for all spells, cooldown reduction, minus 25% for Lore of Ice spells. But again, it's not a great school of magic. And even in the Winds of Magic cost reduction, you look at a regular Ice Witch Lord, and a regular Ice Witch Lord can get a trait, the Glacial Blaster, that gives magical attacks, reduces Winds of Magic cost by 4%, so it's not as good, but still pretty solid. Increases Winds of Magic power reserve capacity plus 20 for the Lord Army, and reduces enemy spell resistance by 10. This is also a trait you can get on Frost Maiden heroes. So the effect over there that Katarin has, like, it's not going to be as good in terms of spell resistance, but you still get the Winds of Magic cost reduction and the Winds of Magic power reserve capacity. So Katarin's faction is good at having a bunch of mages. Katarin as a mage is not really that great. You do get the Embodiment of Winter, and this is where I say that Katarin's trying to do multiple things at once and not really succeeding in any way. She does get extra HP, armor, and permafrost ward, so she's decent in melee, but without the melee skill line. If she had the melee skill line, she would be a freaking amazing melee fighter, I'm not gonna lie. But she doesn't have that melee skill line. And that creates obviously the issue of you're just not as good in melee. She's decently durable, but someone like Drazov is much better in melee and a better caster at the same time, because he's got better magic spells, he's got a skill line that benefits his casting ability with Flames of Asgore in a significant way. This skill is better than where it was before. Melee attack and melee defense for Ice Guard, okay, fairly solid enough, no complaints there. Campaign move, Marine Speed, Strider, okay, decent enough. Con Queen, this is a worse trait than what Boris Ursus has, because you have devotion and reducing enemy leadership, that's great, but Boris Ursus gets more diplomatic relations with Kislev through this. You only get 10, he gets more for that. You do get allegiance points gained, 100% for alliances with Kislev, but that is a bit redundant as a benefit, because if you're playing a Kislev campaign, it's fairly easy and encouraged to confederate other legendary lords of Kislev, or all the factions of Kislev that do survive by the time you meet them. So having an allegiance points gained for alliances with Kislev is questionable. I would say it would be great if it was allegiance points gained with Empire and Dwarves, because that would be a significant benefit, but it's only with Kislev, sadly enough. And there's even a significant nerf in terms of shield and ice. This used to be ward save, now it's missile block chance, and 360 missile block and immune to flanking. The immune to flanking is the only useful thing here. The reason missile block chance is not really important if you're playing a Kislev campaign is, like, you may have fraught with range units, sure, maybe, or he'll just throw a bunch of clan rats as Skaven slaves, right? The only race, though, that would have possibly a significant amount of range units, and even then it's not guaranteed, would be the Cast Dwarves. I say not guaranteed because the Cast Dwarves the Cast Dwarf AI does tend to recruit a bunch of melee units, or their range is incredibly weak. So this benefit is not going to really help you out. The previous benefit was just flat out better. Another thing to also point out about Katarin is her quest items. One of them easy enough to gain. The other one, though, has you dealing with one of the more difficult quest battles in the entire game, because it's an ambush battle, and that can be pretty annoying to actually get. It does increase her durability, so she's a decent tank, but she lacks the damage to be exceptionally useful. And this is more important for Kislev than you might think. See, Kislev has melee support heroes, right, with Patriarchs, but Patriarchs are not going to do a significant amount of damage in melee. You do have the Golden Knight, to be sure, and all the benefits that come from the Golden Knight, but having melee damage capability is important. That's where Boris Ursus comes in. You might say, well, Astankia doesn't have that. Astankia has many other benefits, like she actually has good magic that she can use. Like, you want to have Astankia as a magic user. You don't really care. Like, if I'm playing Katarin campaign, I will never bother with the Ice Tree. Instead, I'll focus on her army skills. Hell, I would rather get a Lightning Strike, special skill line, minus Shield of Ice, but yeah, you know, get the stuff that's useful and get a Lightning Strike over here as opposed to spending any point and relying on Frost Maidens or literally a second Ice Switch following in her path to actually provide the magic support in battle. I think that's a better decision if you're playing Katarin. So those are the kind of things to take into consideration. The pros, you do have some decent faction effects. You do have the safest starting position of all the Kislev Legendary Lords, funnily enough at the moment. Originally, it used to be the problem, you know, like Azag, Draika would be an issue, but because of changes to Dwarves, changes to AI, changes to AI aggressiveness, and all that kind of stuff, like, you can be fairly safe. Like, actually, the biggest threat might be Festus, but compared to, you know, Boris's insanity of being sandwiched between Arbol, the Demon Prince, and Archeon, is a safer campaign. But just being safe does not make it good. What would I say on the subject? Well, I think there's some pros and some cons on this. The pro is, compared to Castalton, that you will have a better time getting Ice Court support. And it's easier to get to focus on Orthodoxy support than Ice Court support if you're also gaining Ice Court support for battles against Chaos. So that is a pro. Some of the faction effects are better than Castalton, but they don't compare to Boris Ursus's campaign mechanics or faction effects. I think like what Katarin really needed would be some spell benefit or some lesser version of Gelt's Colleges of Magic. I say lesser because obviously she's focused on ice magic and Tempest magic. She should have both schools of magic, by the way, as far as I see it, or a combination of spells from both of them. Or at the very least, Ice Mistress should reduce the Winds of Magic cost by far more than it does. Because that's the problem with Ice Mistress. It is reducing the cost, but it is pretty much insignificant. It's literally not worth bothering with, really, when you're thinking about it. Yes, you might cast a lot of spells, but you're still going to run out of Winds of Magic. And not necessarily that much slower as you might think. Her Ice Witches, her armies, you could consider the fact that the various armies she have will be pretty solid, but if you're looking at playing a Legendary Lord of Kislev that has really powerful armies, Astankia is the one winner in that respect. Because the hexes, curses, blessings, all that she has, obviously you can use them in many different situations. But those are some considerations on the subject. I do think there's pros compared to Castalton, sure. There's also downsides compared to Castalton, absolutely. But both Castalton and Katarin are behind the Astankia and Boris Ursus. So keep that in mind. I think that Creative Assembly decided to focus on racial rework, of course, but I do kind of agree with the sentiment that I've seen where people are saying they should have unique mechanics. Because you can have campaigns in close proximity to each other, but because of the campaign mechanics, they can be wildly different. Like, no one would seriously argue that a campaign as Karl Franz is the same campaign as Elspeth, and they literally start next to each other. They deal with many of the same problems, but the way they deal with them and the dynamics of their respective campaigns are wildly different. And you can even add Gelt, because Gelt does benefit a lot by going into the Empire, where he's literally gonna teleport to Altdorf. But again, that is a very different campaign dynamic. I do appreciate the racial rework, but yeah, I think Katarin, she's in much better state as a Legendary Lord. She's certainly higher on a tier list I would do of the Legendary Lords, but I think this is the least interesting campaign of Kislev to play at the moment. That's my perspective. Costine signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications. Stay tuned for more.